welcome back. I hope everybody is having a good week, staying healthy, staying safe out there. I'm in a pretty good mood. Left my house today. That's always a big thing, all masked up. Before we get started with our lecture today, where I will be doing some Sgraffito style lettering and just sort of talking about some methods for putting really like clean, tight lettering on your pieces, I want to show you a piece that I made using the fake brick slab that I created for a demo a few weeks ago. So I just turned it into a tall, thin column planter, I guess you want to call it. Sort of needed a new one of these. Here's a side with some the underglazed bricks. By the time I actually joined this, the slabs were pretty crispy. So we'll see if it survives firing. But so far so good. I have certain plants that love a planter like this, tall and skinny. Specifically my jade plants. So this will get a new jade buddy after it's fired to cone 6. And that red clay that I made it with is a commercial clay. It's standard 308 Brooklyn Red. Really, really groggy, gritty clay. I think it's like a cone 4 to 8 clay, but I fire it at cone 6. You get a nice toasty bright red that you might more so associate with reduction firing, but it's cone 6 oxidation electric firing. Love that clay. Yeah, so anyway, happy with how that came out, aside from the part where it might collapse in firing. Yeah, so anyway, back to today's topic. So, you know, I've done a variety of sort of Sgraffito techniques in this class and previous iterations of this class. And I think one of the most valuable technical Sgraffito things that I've learned over time is, like I said, good, clean writing in Sgraffito. It's something that you see pretty much all throughout history. As soon as potters figured out how to put one different colored clay on top of another and carve through and get a contrasting line, writing is something that you see pop up, you know, pretty much concurrently with that. And actually, even before that, you have a lot of Roman transport amphora that have scribbles on the side of, you know, what the contents might have been. So like writing on pottery goes back in so many forms. So today I was hoping to do some writing on this white stoneware platter. So I've just prepared a pretty typical platter. I'm going to turn my screen down now. Hopefully this will be good enough to view. Hopefully this light is even enough for everybody to see. So this platter is leather hard. If I squeezed it really hard, I could probably indent the surface, but you can also see this is a fairly thick platter. It's about 1/2 inch thick. I made this on my trusty hump mold that fits on top of my wheel head. I have this like, it's probably weighs 30 pounds. It's like giant plaster hump mold that has grommets on the bottom so you can fit it on a wheel head, because that allows you to hand roll a slab and then you just slip and score a coil on there. And then because it fits on the wheel head, you can then make a really clean flat foot. You know, if that's what you're into. You can also, of course, just hand build the foot. It's a great tool. I'm not sure that the company that makes that is making the same one anymore, but it is the Ceramic Shop's Hydrobat hump molds. I have several of them and I really, really love them. Probably cost an arm and a leg to ship, but you know, once delivery is a thing again, maybe that's what we do. So I often will make platters that have either like names and dates on them, as I do a lot of commemorative work. Maybe it'll have like a, you know, a cheesy phrase or a corny platitude. And so for today, I think I came up with a sort of appropriate topic to do. I don't know about everybody out there, but I have definitely gone down a sort of dystopian rabbit hole in terms of my music listening. Um, my musical tastes today could probably be described as, you know, like music to get divorced to 1984 through 1991 or something. Uh, Lots of, like 80s, like Phil Collins, Genesis, and Peter Gabriel, and Huey Lewis. I don't even know. I don't know what's come over me, but that's what's keeping me sane, getting me through. So on that note, one of the tunes that I cannot stop listening to is Genesis's horrifying video from, I think, 1984, Land of Confusion. That was this video with all these, like, political actors of the time, like, done up in these, like, horrifying, grotesque foam puppets. And seeing that as a child, I'm pretty sure I can say that and The Labyrinth, like, altered the course of my life. So on that note, I'm going to be decorating this platter with some lettering around the outside and an image on the inside. I'm going to save the image for a little bit later. What happens with these platters is, even though it's pretty thick, this top edge is going to be the first part to really start to dry out and get hard. So you have a little bit of working time with this lower center part. And in fact, you might want to carve this last because this clay is generally a little wetter and you get that sort of Sgraffito dog ear effect if the clay is too wet. So we're just going to be doing a phrase along the outside of this platter first, and then later, off camera, I'm going to plop an image in here. And because we're living in these contaminated times, I thought it might be good to make, I'll be one of the many people who are making some sort of an homage to hand washing. And so I'm going to do an image of hand washing in the center. And then along this exterior, I am going to have a quote from the aforementioned Genesis song, Land of Confusion. It will say appropriately, "This is the world we live in. These are the hands we're given." And then there's going to be, some sort of awesome image of hand washing in the center. And, who wouldn't want that to commemorate this very strange time? So that's what we're going to do. Yeah, is the topic all that great? But I do believe that, one thing that's amazing about pottery is it's always been a vehicle of capturing the time, whether that's the artist's intent or not. If you go to an archaeological site, the pottery chronology that might present there can tell you about, foodways and decorative trends and firing technology and all this stuff that potters may or may not have wanted to include in their pieces. And so we will continue that proud tradition by emblazoning this platter with a lyric from Phil Collins. Okay, so to get started, in this case, we're working with a round platter, but of course, you don't have to do that. This is going to be advice that you can use for any sort of form, but for the case of a round platter, I do want to take advantage of this form, of this shape, and I want that work to be clean. So as you can see, as usual, I'm working on a turntable, and the more you work on a turntable, particularly for decorative things, you will see that it really is a two-handed effort. You will really be working, it won't be just like carving with one hand and turning the turntable with the other. It's sort of like wheel throwing. These things wind up working very much together to form the final product. So the first thing that I'm doing is sort of tapping my platter to the center of the turntable. The only reason I'm doing that is because I do want to have, firstly, an even border around the exterior of the platter. And then I want to lay out a band, a thin band that will sort of serve as the the boundaries, the confinement for our lettering. To do clean lettering, I find that if we first lay down a really thin light line, something that we will buff out later. Remember, this is all smoke and mirrors, all smoke and mirrors. We will buff it out later, and then, you know, you can make a piece that people will be like, oh my God, how'd you get the lettering so clean? Again, all just guidelines that you'll just buff out. Again, and this is just like hand lettering. I'm going to talk a little bit more about, you can do stencils, whatnot, that sort of thing. So now that my platter is relatively centered, you know, this platter is not perfectly round. It is a hand rolled slab, and then I did cut the edge, you know, whatever. I kind of like how it's like a little, you know, it's not that perfectly symmetrical wheel thrown thing. But that said, it will look fairly symmetrical once it's on a wall. So the first thing I'm going to do is lay down that border. So I want to come in, this is probably about half an inch, about a centimeter. And so that's going to serve as my first sort of boundary. So I'm keeping my right hand fairly still, adjusting as needed, and turning the piece with my left hand. And you can see I'm dragging just this large ball stylus, and I'm making just a light line, enough for me to see. And now I've come full circle, and I don't know if you can, is this, yeah, there you go. You can see right down there. I know this lighting is tough to see, but it's a shallow mark that I've made. It's a shallow mark, but it's one that I can see pretty well. Of course, doing that got my plate a little bit off center again, but I'll just tap it back into shape. All right, good enough. All right, so sometimes I'll also create a border like this to give myself a confine for doing like a sawtooth edge, and that's the lower line of it, so all like the edges of the sawtooths look nice and even, you know, whatever. You can do all kinds of things, but because this is sort of a lettering demo, we're just going to focus on the lettering. I'm not going to give myself enough room to do a full-on carved border, or maybe I should, because that might look cool. Yeah, you know what, I'll do a carved border. All right, so I'm just going to do another slightly thinner line that's going to serve as the boundary for our writing. And of course, I picked an 80s Genesis lyric that has a lot of words in it, so this is going to be fun. But all good. All right, so there's our other boundary. And then for the words, I want them to be maybe like an inch tall. So we'll do about an inch border for that. Now, for any sort of typology people out there, or anybody who really relishes in sort of the perfectionism that ceramics can ask of you, this can be a fun moment to either do things by hand and just see how perfect and clean you can get them, or you can simply, you know, trace. This is a sort of method that's going to cover all sorts of versions of that. Okay, so here's our ring where we're going to be writing and inscribing. And so one of the most important things to know is how long your words are going to be. Like, we want them evenly spaced. We don't want any weird marks. And so the easiest way to do that is to count your letters. So I have some scrap paper here. This is always a good idea to have on hand when you're doing lettering and whatnot, because what you can do is scribble out what you're going to write, put it on your piece, take a stylus and trace over it. We're going to do that for the second part of the phrase. For the first part, we're just going to sort of freehand it. So the first part of this phrase is, this is the world we live in. And if you are like me, um, I can barely spell. Uh, you might want to just make sure everything's spelled correctly. This all looks correct. These are all, short words that, I think I've mastered at this point. Um, but it can never hurt to check. It's kind of ironic. I do a ton of commissions with like last names and dates and whatnot. And it is like, it's my albatross. I can't even tell you how many times I've spelled things wrong. Now I have a pretty good system. I usually do a pre-sketch that's mostly for the spelling. And then I send that to clients, and then they're like, that's okay, everything's spelled right. Or they're like, oh my God, you mangled my last name, even though I sent you 5 emails with it and it's spelled correctly. We all have our burdens. So anyway, what you're going to do then is, once you have your phrase all written down, you're going to count the letters and the spaces. Now, certain letters take up less space, yes, such as I takes up the least amount of space of any letter, but we're going to leave that for now. And then I usually like my writing pretty spaced out. So I like to leave about an even 2 spaces between each word. So I'm just drawing a little box. So when I go through and count these letters, I can count those. I think that's a really important thing for making writing look clean. The spaces that occur between letters and words is called kerning, and you want your kerning to be consistent, to be clean, to make sense, whatever. So let's see, let's count. Wow, it's a lot of letters, 34 letters. That's good to know. So ideally for this piece, I would like it if it's really evenly bisected. Now, in some Pennsylvania redware, you will see the lettering be continuous and go all the way around, indicating sort of that's a piece that's meant to be viewed and understood on a tabletop. However, I like to think that maybe someday my Phil Collins tribute pottery will be displayed on a wall. So instead of making everything sort of going in the same orientation, I'm going to create this on a plane so it will be viewable from a wall, and so the bottom part won't just be, like upside down. So to do that, I'm going to sort of try to split my frame in half. I love to use ribs like this. This is just a mud tool rib. One thing that you can do that's really nice is you can rock that rib in a straight line to make straight lines on curved surfaces. That's one thing that I love to do it. And I do really want this to be about half and half. So another thing with this platter, I have not yet poked holes in the bottom on the foot, because that's usually what I'll do for something that may be hung on a wall. So you have a little leeway in terms of what you want the top of your platter to be. And remember, this isn't a perfectly symmetrical form, so you can sort of like feel that out. And I kind of like right here. That seems good. And so I'm going to take, let's see, my halfway point, my center point's about there. So I'm going to draw a little line in half by just rocking my rib lightly across the surface. And so it's tough to see, but I have like almost like a little sort of razor line right there. That's our halfway point. So we want, this is the world we live in, to fit on this half, right? So we have 34 letters. Half of 34 is 17. And so in each sort of quadrant, we need to fit 17 letters. So that's a lot. That's a lot of letters. And that halfway point will come about halfway between world. So WORLD should be here. So this is the world we live in. Yeah, that's a lot. I might have to make my little boundary a little smaller. And then, you know, you can sort of chop it down further by quadrants. So we have about 17 letters per half, and that means that we have 8.5 letters per this section. That's a lot. That's a lot. We might need to make our little ring a little bit smaller. Let's see. So we just need to fit, this is the world. All right. Chopping it up. Chopping it up. All right. Yeah, considering the size of these letters, I do need to make my boundaries a little bit smaller just so I can fit everything in the sort of open font that I want. So I'm going in and I'm chopping off about a 1/4 inch from my little guideline, my ring. And here you'll notice I'm doing a little bit of a different method. I'm sort of just going in and drawing it by hand instead of the sort of stationary line that I did before. And the only reason for that is it allows me to clean up the slight variation that we got in that line thickness when I just did it all quick, trying to look cool in my demo. Like, oh yeah, I could do this so fast. I'm just like, I'm not good. Everything comes so naturally. And this lower part where the other half of the phrase is going to go, those lines wound up getting a little shaky, a little bit thinner. So this also allows me to sort of course correct that a little bit. Okay. So now from here, I just need to fit, I have a little small section here that goes from about here to here. So I only have 2 words I have to fit in there, 2.5 words to fit in here, and so on. So I think I have enough to space this out evenly, just freehand. Now, for any font nerds out there, I find that at this stage, you just want to put down the base shape of your letter. If you are a fan of serif fonts, you know, with those little, you know, decorative, like, you know, things on the end of letters, I would recommend not necessarily putting those on at this point, because then when you carve through the underglaze later, you can just sort of stylistically insert those in. This is more about maintaining the spacing of where letters are going to go. All right. So I'm keeping my letters entirely contained between this top line here and this bottom line here. And, you know, I feel like the lighting that I have in this video is just probably, you know, annoying for you to watch, but what basically I have here is an eye level light. Really important that if you're doing close work like this, that you do have correct lighting, even if it looks awful on a camera. And so I'm just using my large stylus to flesh out these letters. And I'm not cutting too deep. I'm not cutting like Sgraffito deep yet. I just want to lay these out. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a sponge and buff out all these guidelines. So it looks like we've just freakishly put this perfectly down. But the thing is, these lines we're laying down for the lettering, those are guidelines too. So once the sort of letter boundary guidelines are buffed out, what we're going to do is paint this area over with black underglaze and then use this guide to carve through. And here I'm making an effort, like letters that I am repeating a lot in this phrase, E's, H's, T's. I'm trying to make sure that they look the same as I put down new ones. All right, so here is our first. Oh my God, I can't see anything on the Zoom screen. Okay, let me find another way to do this. Another way to like this. Here, like this. All right, you can see, I'm mainly showing this to show my letters have been drawn pretty shallow, but they're not quite as shallow as our guidelines. So when I buff out those guidelines, the letters will still faintly remain, and then I'll be able to see those under the underglaze that I paint on. Yeah. So that's sort of part one. So that's just the sort of counting letters and laying them down sort of a way. Got to count your letters. And now for the next phrase, we're going to do something that's going to be maybe a little bit of a better methodology for people who might not be so keen to just like lay down a bunch of clean text. I know that's like not in everybody's wheelhouse for sure. So next up, we're still going to do our counting the letters. So this is the world we live in. These are the hands we get. All right, that might be a lot more letters. Oh. I don't know, maybe it's about the same. Put that in my double spaces. So for this weir with the apostrophe, I'm just going to count that as 4 spaces because that little apostrophe isn't going to take up a ton of room. Okay, 36. So that's not like a ton off from the other one. You know, if we had significantly more letters in this other phrase, considering we just cut the plate in half, you know, maybe I should have counted the letters first. You know, that might look a little wonky, but I think we're going to be all right. So half the plate is going to be 18 letters. And right, 18. And then, of course, half of that will be 9. And so much like we did with the top section, we're just going to partition out the bottom section into 4 little parts just to make it a little easier for us to like brick out our lettering. And you might be wondering if there's pottery products that will already quarter, third, measure out your sort of surface for you. And yes, there are. There's a, oh my God, what is it called? There's a tool that's like a plastic disc that has holes poked in sort of radial things in quarters, in thirds, whatever. And you lay it over your piece and go through with a needle tool and mark what it is. What that thing is called, I really can't remember. So probably not much of a help. So you can see my letters fit perfectly. They fit perfectly. So these lettering guides that we've laid down, they won't just serve as a marker to tell you where you're going to cut with your carving tools once we get a black underglaze on here. They actually do serve as a physical guide for your tool, your carving tool, particularly if you wind up carving with your stylus as well. So any given set of letters is going to be a combination of straight angular lines and curving lines. What I find for making super clean lettering is it looks cleanest in my experience when you use a stylus for the curves and a sort of slicing kind of a tool like one of these Kemper mini ribbon tools. Oh yeah, tiny triangle. That's a good one. Yeah, tiny triangle, one of my all-time faves. This is a lettering MVP tool. So this is really great for straight lines. Yeah, but before that, because these do sort of act as little channels for your tool to move, what I'm going to do is go through and give this a pass and just go in a tiny bit deeper to make a solid guideline. This gives me a moment to clean up the lettering lines a little bit, create a better guideline for my tool a little bit, and also sort of address any sort of inconsistencies in this, whatever. So let's see here. So what we want to do is when we go over our letters again, we don't want to drive our tool so deep that once this is coated with underglaze, we're going to have to dig super deep in to get that all out. We just want to make it deep enough to have like a clean line. And I actually find that even if you're intending on cutting rather thin letters, I like to use this wide stylus, and because then you can carve out the letter from within that and you have almost an even starker contrast between the surface and the interior color, because you have sort of a difference in depth as well. But that's just me. I've been down a bit of a rabbit hole with this stuff. All right, so I'm just going to give these letters one more pass. Please pardon my annoying eye level lamp. And so what I have here is this lamp is in front of me, and this way my tool and my hand is not casting light on the immediate area where I'm working, which is why this lamp is here. One tendency that the more angular letters tend to have when you're laying them out like this is I will often, like right now I'm doing a little H here, I'll tend to make the sort of lines bend down, when you're putting it on a curve. So this is a good moment to go through and sort of correct any sort of orientation issues with your letter like that. And so these are much stronger and confident lines than the original lines that I had laid down to be the guides. And Colin, if you're editing this, you can like, I don't know, fast forward through most of this, probably. Also, what's up? I'm really hoping that by finishing this piece, it will sort of exercise this like Phil Collins demon out of me, and I'll be over it, able to move on to a different sort of playlist. something happier, something a little more contemporary, something with less puppets. All right, so this is looking a lot cleaner already. And of course, if you were to do this on a flat surface, like a tile, you know, wall hanging kind of a thing, a little bit easier than doing it on a curved surface. All right, and so I'm going to be momentarily covering this with black underglaze, but just this edge. I'm not quite ready to, you know, sort of freehand the entire interior of this. So on that note, I'm just going to clean up my border where the bottommost part where I want the black underglaze to be painted on. So much like our lettering, I'm just going a little bit deeper with that too. And that's just going to provide me with an important boundary when I go to paint this. Oh, so this is great. I've encountered a little bit of a foible spot where my line isn't doing what I want it to do. So I'm taking this tool. This is called a wipeout tool. And it was originally developed to sort of clean up China paint sort of surface messes, but it's a great all-around pottery tool for getting in edges, whatnot. And it has these two rubber tips. And what I love to use this for is if I have a line that I've carved that I don't love, this acts as sort of like a little spackle on the surface that can sort of force your old lines back down. I might take a sponge and add a little water to that to sort of erase them out. And I would like to point out that I am using a commercial white stoneware now that has a pretty, it has a high grog content, but none of that grog is coarse grog. It has a lot of fine grog and maybe some medium grog in there. So when I brush over the surface, that grog's not all really apparently coming to the top like it does with something like our T1, which has a huge fraction of coarse grog. So basically, when you do sort of clean up a surface with a sponge and you see that grog come to the surface, what's actually happening is you're just simply wiping away all the flat, super tiny clay particles that surround each piece of grog in a big ceramics matrix. And those big pieces of grog are sort of like launched in the surface like boulders in a field, right? You're just wiping out everything around them, which is why it seems like, you know, grog can come to the surface. With this clay, you don't get that feeling so much. It's definitely happening. It's just not nearly as visible as it is with a clay like T1. Anyway, back to my redone line. So I'm just widening my line here a little bit, cleaning it up as we get on to the next stage. Much better. And we're going to have black go all the way to the edge. I also did a little sort of guide here. And I think what I would like to do is do a sawtooth edge. It's going to be, you can totally freehand your sawtooth edge. But one thing that stinks about that is if you're carving into a surface, you're doing little tiny triangles and you get to the very end and you make a little skinny one, it's going to be obvious to everyone that, you know, you don't have perfect measuring skills or whatever. So at this stage too, I like to go through and just lay out my sawtooth design. It makes them a little cleaner. And we'll be cutting through these with. Now you might be thinking, well, Gina, this seems like double the work. And in some ways, indeed it is. But basically, once we get the underglaze down on here, all the carving is just work that's laid out for you. And then it just becomes a task that you have to do like neatly and cleanly. And those mindless feats of technical skill can be a very relaxing thing to lean into during these times. Again, this part you don't have to do. If you're confident in your perfectly even triangle sawtooth skills, that's great. But my goal here is to buff out this first line that we laid down that sort of acts as a guide. I don't want that visible when I lay down my, excuse me, my underglaze. So in addition to getting really, really, really into reality TV during this time, I've also tried to get into tea for the first time in my life. And I'm currently drinking a delicious green rice tea called, I think it's Genmaicha or something like that. And it is delicious. I mean, this is a compliment, but it tastes like a cup of dirt. So that's my COVID recommendation. Terrible Phil Collins playlist and this tea that tastes like dirt. Delicious. All right, we're coming up to the part where the two lines join. So now I want to be extra careful about how my little triangles are spaced. So here, it looks like I can fit about 2 more without having it look weird. That's right. All right, so that's pretty good. So I did my triangles out of the gates with, yep, see the little sawtooth edges? Did my little triangles a little bit deeper than the guideline that sort of set, I don't know, set their bottommost boundary. We have all these beautiful deep letters, and now is the time that we're going to take a sponge and go over the surface and buff out those guidelines. That's really what makes this look like, this is what will make this look like sort of a feat. So I have 2 sponges for doing this. This is just a regular studio sponge. And for a fine-grained clay like this, that's usually totally sufficient. However, I also have this awesome Mud Tools finishing sponge. This is, I think I've talked about this before in class lecture. This is just a super fine-grained sponge. It's wonderful for working with porcelain or any other fine-grained clays. It really just buffs out any little detail that you want it to. Now, again, we're just going to concentrate on this rim around here. So I'm taking my sponge and I'm just lightly brushing over the surface. So I'm going to do half of this, buff out about half of the guidelines, and then I'll hold it up to the camera so we can hopefully compare how they look. And again, you know, we're going to put underglaze over this, and that will obscure details to some degree, but also it will show those details if our underglaze layer isn't thick enough. So I'm just doing small sort of upward motions to buff out those lines. And because the lines that I cut for both the triangles and the lettering run a bit deeper, I'm really less concerned about those. Those are going to show no matter what. Those I would really have to like put some elbow grease in to buff out. So this is where we're at. So now I can see my sort of guide-like letters, and maybe you can see, okay, so the world might need a little more work, but you can see it's a lot flatter and less messy than this bottom part. So there's a bottom, which I haven't buffed out yet. There's a top, which I did buff out, and then we'll trace over. You know what? This light is casting some shadows that I don't really feel like are accurate. So now I'm gonna give this another pass with my finishing sponge. My guidelines around world and knee and all this, they're a little deep for me, a little bit deep. So I'm just soaking my finishing sponge here. Because this finishing sponge is so fine grained, it takes a moment to absorb water. But there we go. So now I'm just taking an edge of this, and the shape is really nice too, and just getting in here, buffing out. Between words, between letters. All right, for the sake of a demo, I think it's good enough. And now I'm gonna do the same thing on the bottom. Buffing away. All right, good enough. So now the past hour of work that I've done or whatever, you can barely see it, and that's exactly what we want. So now I'm gonna move on to painting underglaze just along this border. Again, I'm just gonna leave the inside bare for now. I'm gonna put a different image in there and, you know, underglaze and paint that at some point. So I just have Velvet Underglaze Greatest Hits Jet Black here, and I have a soft, small paintbrush. Is this a very tiny paintbrush for the task at hand? Yes, it is, but it's soft and it allows me to bump down any sort of underglaze brush stroke as I go. And again, this is a nice moment to work with, you know, have both of your hands working together. Now for underglaze, black underglaze on a white clay body, you probably could get away with just one coat. I think we're gonna have to do two here, just because I'm seeing a little streakiness, and with underglazes, for the most part, what you see is what you get. Depending on the type of mark making you like, obviously you could use a bigger soft brush for this stage. I just really don't want my underglaze to look very streaky. I want to have it just like a thin, nicely integrated surface. I also find if you use a smaller brush to paint on your underglaze, you sort of spend a little more time smearing it around this wet surface, and I don't know, maybe it bonds a little better that way. Who's to say? I think generally if you're applying underglaze to greenware, particularly like leather hard greenware, it's going to have a pretty decent bond. So now I'm moving in for layer 2. Yeah, the second layer is giving me much more of that coverage that I want. So we'll be able to stop with 2 layers. We won't necessarily have to move into doing 3. With underglazes, with velvet underglazes, they're formulated to be translucent with one pass somewhat translucent with 2 passes and completely opaque with 3 passes. But you will find certain colors will deviate from that a little bit. There are certain colors like the dark green and any of the sort of chrome-based greens. They will give you great coverage pretty much right away, whereas other particularly like lighter or brighter underglazes, like I'm thinking yellows, pinks, lavenders, like pastels, getting coverage with those is very hard, where sometimes you wind up having to do about 4 coats. And again, what you see is what you get. You want to be really careful if you are putting underglaze over a clay that is darker than your underglaze. In that case, I recommend testing. I mean, of course, I always recommend testing, but you know, that's just going to give you a much better idea as to the chemical changes. Sometimes the lighter and brighter underglazes can be really, really heavily affected if you put them on a darker clay body that has a lot of, you know, high concentration of metallic oxides. Whereas, you know, something like this black underglaze, you know, that is also taking up darker metallic oxides from darker clay bodies, but you just don't see it because the commercial colorants that are already present here mask that and don't make it as apparent. All right, here we go. Almost done. All right, now we get to carving. Okay, so we have underglaze on this. Significantly, I want to point out that my piece is still leather hard, and currently the parts that we will be carving away are going to be leather hard as well. However, these will result in really tiny, tiny pieces that can easily fly around. So I do recommend, you know, wearing a mask. Yeah, I know you thought you could maybe get away from the world of wearing a mask by doing some pottery, but you know, I cannot recommend it. So I'll be right back. I'm just gonna grab my mask. And this is, I'm just wearing a little dust mask. So I'm also on top of my my plastic mat. And again, like last week, what I do is I just make a giant mess on this mat and then I pick it up and dump it somewhere. Now, because this is going to be black underglaze offcuts, that I really don't want to go back into my recycled clay. So these scraps I actually will throw away. So I will keep them all on my mat and then I'll just scoop it up and right into the garbage, which I hate to do. And luckily it's just a very small amount of clay. So again, because these platters dry from the edges inward, I'm going to start by by following the guidelines and carving our triangle pattern. I find the quickest way to do that is to do one side and then the other. And again, this is yet another task where I'm working with both hands together. And I'll tell you what, this commercial stoneware is cutting like butter. Very satisfying. Another thing I would like to point out for sgraffito and carving, you want to be really, really careful about the hardness of your platter. If you are working on, or your piece, if you're working on a piece that you want to sgraffito and you found that it has gotten too hard, for the health and safety of your wrists, I really recommend that you don't force that carving. You can really, really injure your wrists that way, especially if you're prone to carpal tunnel. So now we got all of our little, you can see all those little scraps. So that's what you want to throw in the trash because it's not great if that gets back into the clay for reclaim. Not the worst thing in the world, but it's not great. So there's half of our triangle. And now I'm going to go through and do the other side. And the reason that I like to do this is, you know, you just get into sort of a muscle memory mode and your cuts just look a little cleaner and all the same. Can you go, yeah, totally. I just find it looks clean like this. And again, not every design is going to allow you to work from the outside in, but if you are able to, I recommend it because, you know, it's such a bummer if you've carved like a big, beautiful platter and then you go to do the edges and it's hard enough that it could cause injury, but you have to like sort of soldier through. All right. Sawtooth pattern looking pretty sharp. Now we're going to move on to the lettering. So again, I like to use a stylus for my curves and a tiny triangle for my straight lines. So sometimes I'll just go through and carve all of my curves first and then go in and complete everything with the straight lines. Generally, particularly for phrases in I guess all caps, you're gonna definitely have more straight lines than curves. So I usually go in and do the curves first. Bringing my light down low. And remember, all that layout has already been done for you. You're just following orders at this point. And you can see these little crumblies that are coming up. With a stylus, it's almost impossible to avoid. What you're doing with a stylus is pushing clay out of the way. You don't get those crumblies with the triangle tool because you're actually slicing through and cutting through the clay and lifting out and cutting it out. So we don't see that as much, but that's all right. What you can do is just like when you know the platter's relatively wet like this, you don't even want to touch this stuff with these little crumblies. When it gets a little more dry, these crumblies will dry out really, really quickly. And then if you take a soft brush, you can just, you know, shoo them right away. I like to use a sponge brush like this. All right, so for This Is the World We Live In, not many curves. All right, so this first part. Oh, stupid light. You know what? I'll save the big reveal for Another thing you can do to get these letters down, like I said before, is you can just draw them out on paper and trace them. You can actually take a piece of paper like this. Sometimes what I'll do is just sort of mark the edge of my paper like that, and then you can write your, your piece there, and then go through and trace it with a stylus. That's another way to do it. Of course, you can also lay it out in a graphics program. I find that Illustrator is really great for laying out lettering. All right, finally done. Give it one final little brush. Get all the little crispies out. And again, all this mess, I'm just going to tap up and dump it right into the trash. But here's the final result. This is the world we live in. So you can see it's pretty clean, it's pretty even. And then this whole inside is just open for, beautiful decoration of people washing their hands or whatever. So hopefully that little demo was helpful for putting some clean marks on your piece. And next week in class, I'll have a little hand demo, image there, and this will be, a piece for posterity. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope everybody continues to stay safe and healthy out there. And yeah, till next time. Bye.